You exceeds our vision.
Okay, so, as I said yesterday, for those who came, we like to do sometimes things a bit different. When there's no bedtime, it's half term, and because with Shabbat, the Shabbat is Shabbat B'Haratcha, which talks about the menorah and the temple of Jerusalem, which talks about the temple. I thought that maybe. Okay. Help. So everything is. No, yes. Gosh, thank you. Yay! I'm so amazed when it works. The Temple of Jerusalem, that's the. I'm not going to pass everything because I did a series of 4 sessions with the college last year about the Temple of Jerusalem, because that's something which is very central to Judaism, and yet we don't talk about the temple anymore. The temple is very far away from any of our concerns because there has been a major change in the Temple of Jerusalem, which is what happened to the temple. It was destroyed, by the Romans in 70 CE. So the whole biblical religion was based on the temple and the worship at the temple in the Temple of Jerusalem. And after the destruction, there was this massive crisis within Jewish people. So what should we do now that there's no temple anymore? How can we carry on being Jewish without this kind of place that was? You have to think about the temple almost like
the Vatican?
No, I mean the same wealth, certainly, but the temple was kind of a machine to allow repairing a relationship with God. So that was the foundation, the basic usefulness of the temple. Anytime we would break the covenant with God, we would give a certain type of sacrifice to the temple. So there was a very long list, I'm going to show you a bit later, a long list of sacrifices that were used in order to repair the relationship with God. So now when the temple disappeared in 70, the whole system disappeared with it, and we were left with the memory of the temple and the meaning of the temple. And as you know, there were 3 main daily sacrifices in the Temple of Jerusalem: evening, morning, and afternoon. And these 3 daily sacrifices were replaced by what? Do you know? Replaced with sacrifices. So it's not something that, again, it's something that progressive Jews do a lot, because we don't observe Judaism in the strictest way as an Orthodox Jew would do, but an Orthodox Jew prays 3 times a day. So the 3 daily services represent the 3 daily sacrifices in the Temple of Jerusalem. And the whole system was transformed into, so avodah means work or service. The service, avodah, the service in the temple became the service of the heart, which was the name of the previous book of Hebrew Judaism, avodah, service of the heart. Because the service of the heart replaced the service in the temple. So here we have, I named it Between Absence and Presence, the Temple of Jerusalem, because it's this object, so this building is absent now. There are very, very few archaeological rests that allow us to understand that here in Jerusalem, in a very particular place, there was a temple, and yet the temple is very much central to Jewish liturgy. When do we have one service a year we really talk about the temple extensively? Do you remember which service I'm talking about? Yes?
And when the high priest would prostrate it in front of the people.
Yom Kippur afternoon service. In the Yom Kippur afternoon service, we reenact the sacrifice that was given on Yom Kippur in the Temple of Jerusalem. So it's a very long, so we replaced it in Hebrew Judaism by a service that talks about Jewish history and all, the long thread of generations, but traditionally the afternoon service was very much about the sacrifice that the high priest would perform in the Temple of Jerusalem. So it's absent, but it's also very present. So there are actually 3 temples, actually 2 but 3, I'm going to explain you more. So that's the 2nd/3rd temple, and the reason I'm saying that is because this temple, that's a picture from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and that represents the Herod's temple, the last temple that was standing in Jerusalem. The temple that Herod rebuilt in the end of the 1st century BC. King Herod rebuilt the temple, but he rebuilt not the first temple, but the 2nd temple that was actually built after the exile of the Israelites. So just to give you a bit of timeline, the first temple was built by King Solomon. It was destroyed at the end of the 6th century by the Syrians. They destroyed it, and then the Israelites were sent into exile into Babylon. And then 40 years later, no more than that, 70 years later, they were allowed to come back into Jerusalem, and they were allowed to rebuild the temple. And this temple actually was built in the 5th century BC and destroyed in the 1st century CE. So it was kind of 6 centuries building, but it went into decay and Herod rebuilt it. So it's still the 2nd temple, because today when we talk about the 3rd temple, we're talking about the temple that will come back at the end of the time. When the Messiah comes, he will bring back or she will bring back the temple, which is upstairs in heaven, on earth, etc. It would be nice, kind of a messianic movement instead of a messianic movement. It would be nice. So that's actually what you can see today. If you go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, that's what you can see. Now, the first temple, as I said, was built by King Solomon. And when we read the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, there are 2 main stories in the Bible. You've got the books of Samuel and the book of Kings, which are replicated at the end of the Bible in the book of Chronicles, which is a more recent narrative about biblical history, a bit different, with a different angle, etc. But sometimes they just repeat the same material, and sometimes the book of Chronicles bring new material into it. So, but when we read the book of Kings and we read about David's monarchy and Solomon's monarchy, we have this idea of a big city with big palaces and go there. And actually, this is how Jerusalem looked like in the Iron Age. The Iron Age is basically the 11th, 10th century BCE. So that's the equivalent today of what's called today in Judah the city of David. And if you look, you can see there's a little hill. Can you see if I do that? Yes. So there's a little hill here, and the temple was here up there. And the modern city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem is actually up there, okay? So, as you can see, Jerusalem in the Iron Age, so there's, of course, a reproduction. It's not a picture taken from the Iron Age. It's how archaeologists have reconstructed, this, the city in those days.
The whole thing's defensive, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's defensive.
Yes, absolutely. So, because there were lots of wars in those days, so Jerusalem in the Iron Age, if you think about Jerusalem wasn't part of the territory that was divided when they conquered Jerusalem wasn't given to any of the tribes. So it's just King David, who originally settled in Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem. Then he took over Jerusalem and made Jerusalem his capital. But it was kind of a remote place with apparently little people living there, not much. But it's a very defensive location. You've got the two valleys, the hills, you've got these very big walls here. So there's still one portion of this wall that exists that they found in Jerusalem today. So we can prove that this existed. But everything I'm saying, as you can imagine, is very contentious because today, proving that there was a temple in Jerusalem, proving that Jerusalem was a Jewish city in the Iron Age, is such a big deal in Middle Eastern politics. For example, the Muslim authorities that are in charge of the Temple Mount do not allow any archaeological survey in this place. They don't want it. It's a holy place, etc. But it's impossible to do any sort of archaeological survey in this place because they don't want, because they pretend that there was no temple here. And of course, archaeologists want to prove what they're saying. So it's a very contentious place. However, there are enough archaeological proofs to say that there was a Jewish city there in their time, a very small one. So originally it was probably more kind of an administrative place. So you had the king's palace, and all the civil servants and the priests, etc. It wasn't a city with inhabitants like London, people from all sorts of places. Only later that people started to settle. It was mainly the place of power, but it was a very strong place of power where you had the king's palace, the king's courts, the king's administration, and of course, because this goes hand in hand, you also had religious power there. And here, if you look, I don't know if you can see that, it's a reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem up there, and the orientation is, east to west, north to south. Sorry?
I can't see what you're doing.
Can you see when I'm doing that?
No.
Okay.
It's right. The very top.
Oh, okay. So that's the reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. And if you look at the orientation of the building, that's the east, and that's the west, and north and south. So there's a orientation. It's kind of a religious orientation because east to west in the rising sun, and the sun rises in the east and illuminates the inside. And if you look back here, you've got the Holy of Holies. I'm going to show you this a bit better later. But the Holy of Holies, the place in the temple where no one except the high priest once a year was allowed to enter. And of course, when the sun rises in the morning, the rays of the sun goes very deep into that. So, very small city. It's not this kind of metropole or megalopole that we think of when you read the Book of Kings, but we have to think about historical biblical books as a work of propaganda. They really wanted to make the point. It's not history as, you open a book about the history of Wales, for example. You'll have a historian who will explain, based on documentation, etc. In biblical history and biblical books were there to make a point. So this is why they say Jerusalem was this massive city.
Just one gate into the whole area. This eastern one, yeah? Is that
So this is the east.
the gate?
Yeah, this gate, yes.
Thank you.
So, and this, that's in the south of the old cities of Jerusalem. And I mean, it's such a political mess here because you've got the ultra-right, they try to, because this used to be a Palestinian part of the city. So they expelled Palestinians to settle. And you've got, I remember seeing in one Jewish houses with very high walls and barbed wires and cameras and an Israeli flag, and oh my God, how, you really need to have a complicated life if you want to live over there. Huh? But you know, I just want us to be aware that it's a very contentious part of Jerusalem today, but I'm just interested in history here. I'm not doing politics. Politics change, right? But you know, this is what archaeology...
It was very tribal in those days.
Yes.
So tribal.
It's still tribal today.
Palestinians,
Yeah.
and they're obviously always fighting over
Yeah.
students.
So now let's go to the temple itself. So I just wanted to give you a bit of the context of the environment of Jerusalem in the Iron Age. Small city, administrative center with political power and religious power. And kings and high priests, we know where. It's like Aaron and Moses. You know, in Judaism, you've got this double line of leadership. You've got the religious leadership and the political leadership. And, you know, it's not always clear, you know, what divides them. Now, if you go back to Torah and all this description of the tabernacle, so which is the next slide, the tabernacle in, can you see? Oh, yeah, brilliant. So that is the portable sanctuary that the children of Israel built, and we've got loads of description in the book of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and we've got all this description of the tabernacle, and you know, it's clear that when they describe it, because most of biblical texts were written at the end of the oldest were written at the end of the first temple period, and most of them were written either between during the exile or just when they came back from exile. So they had a very strong sense of the temple as a building in stones. So it's something we see, we can read all the time. You know, you've got all the, so yes, you've got the notion of a sacred space. Sacrum is separation, separation between the sacred and the profane. So you've got the separation, then you've got the different altars, the slaughter tables, the brazen altar. So there's an entrance, also the direction is very clear. Like in all Middle Eastern temples, you also have this direction, you know, south, east to west. And the further inside you get into, you've got how do I call it? The holy and the holy of holies behind the curtains. Do you know what was kept there? What was stored there? The ark, yes, with the tablets of the law. So of course, you know, it's such a sacred object. You can't just say hello, how are you? No, so it had to be kept separated out of the sight of anyone. Again, except the high priest once a year. So that's in a way the blueprint of the Temple of Jerusalem, because the Temple of Jerusalem is based on these principles of separation first. You know, that's very important. And the court where sacrifices were performed, and also then the notion of holiness when you got into. So it's a sacred space.
This is a temporary structure.
This
Yes.
is one they found.
So that's the tabernacle. That's the little portable sanctuary they built in the desert, and they carried with them anytime they would move around. And of course, at the end, when they didn't need it anymore, so they just kept, you know, some of the items here, and the ark with the tablets were brought into the Temple of Solomon until the Syrians came and stole them, and we lost them. Because in the temple, the second temple, we don't have the tablets anymore. They were stolen. I mean...
They were stolen, were they in between the two temples? I
was going to say that in the second temple, the tablets were already lost, were they?
Yes, they're already.
Is that mentioned ever, or was it too often to mention? I mean, is it in the biblical text?
Yes, it's mentioned somewhere that they took the vessels and the ark and everything to Babylon with them. Basically, they looted the temple. It's what they used to do. You know, you go in, you take all the gold and the bronze and the silver. It's a culture based on metals. You know, we talk about the Iron Age for a reason. Iron was really the most important material for them. And of course, gold and silver were wealth. It was really wealth was gold and silver, but anything metal was used to make weapons, because they use bronze and iron to make weapons.
The tablets of stone.
Tablets were stones.
I mean, they were exceptional.
Maybe for them it didn't mean anything, you know. It wasn't an object that was precious in terms of value, like merchandise value. It was a religious artifact, important for people who put so much into it. But maybe for the Assyrians it meant nothing and they just dropped it. We don't know that. So the ark has also disappeared. We don't know. Of course, we all think about Indiana Jones and these kind of movies. But you know, the end of the movie, I was really struck by the power that is in a religious artifact like this. It's very powerful, you know. Of course, you can't see all the light, killing all the baddies. That would be great, but you know, it doesn't work like this. But you know, these objects have a very strong power because they're important to us. We invest so much in them, but we don't have this anymore. So that's indeed, you know, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, you know, the place where God would dwell among the people, etc., carried by the Levites what's the word? And the Kohanim, the priests, you know, would perform all the rituals. So the Levites were actually the people carrying it. Okay. So of course I found this on an American website, hence, you know, American football field. I have no idea of the size of an American football field. It's not that big. I mean, I think that if you look at this poor cow who is about to be slaughtered, yes. Okay. Now, before we go into the next slide, I wanted to read the text with you. Does it work? No, it's not that. How is it? Okay. Yes. So the question, of course, is who is allowed to build the temple? And as you know, King David wasn't allowed to build the temple, even though God asked him to do it, but he couldn't do that. And the reason is given here. So then King David summoned his son Solomon and charged him with building the house for the eternal God of Israel. So it's in the book of Chronicles, the first book of Chronicles. David said to Solomon, "My son, I wanted to build a house for the name of the eternal my God, but the word of the eternal came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and fought great battles. You shall not build a house for my name, for you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man at rest, for I will give him rest from all his enemies on all sides. Solomon will be his name. Solomon, Shlomo, Shalom, peace. Solomon will be his name, and I shall confer peace and quiet in Israel in his time. He will build a house for my name, he shall be a son to me, and I to him a father, and I will establish his throne of kingship over Israel forever." So, why was David not allowed to build the temple?
That's Shabbat.
Okay, there's a story about Shema. Okay, can you tell us a bit, maybe to remind for those who don't remember? Remember the story of Bathsheba?
Well, she was married to somebody else, and David liked her, and he had her husband killed.
Yeah. So he was, it's interesting because her husband was an Uri, he was a Hittite, he wasn't Israelite. Yeah, which is quite interesting, because we think sometimes of Judaism very, firm boundaries, but actually, in those days, where, you were Jewish through your father, not through the mother. So therefore, it didn't really matter where the mother came from, but matter where the husband, where the father came from. So, as you said, he saw Bathsheba, and she was beautiful, and he coveted her, which is forbidden according to all the commandments. And he sent her husband into battle, and the first front, and he died. And the son they had together died as well as a punishment, which kind of, right. Biblical times. So sometimes, wow, how do you punish a child for the parents' sins? But it's another world. So there was that. There was also all the wars that David had to wage, because he extended from Jerusalem and the region around Jerusalem. He created this massive, almost empire that went from Lebanon to Egypt, from Jordan to the sea. It was a big, big kingdom. But of course, all these things come at a price, and he waged a lot of wars. And what does it say about the temple? I think it has a very interesting teaching about the temple here. What the temple should be.
House.
A house, yes. But more than just a house. Peace, the house of peace. It cannot be built on blood. It cannot be built on crime or on sins, if we want to use an old word like this. I mean, Solomon, to be honest with you, he had 300 wives, 700 concubines, he also raised more. But that's not
Quickly at the time.
Got degree in maths.
Sorry?
Got degree in maths.
So, yeah, I mean, it was
Hectic.
what a bloke, yes. I think you were reincarnation of Solomon.
It's like Boris kind of children.
So I wouldn't say that he had a kind of
Sorry.
life, quiet life. But anyway, also him too. But it's all about the reputation of. Think about the lay queen. The lay queen is it's almost like a saint in the way we build the image around her. But I think actually we don't really know who she was, because she was behind very strict fences, and we don't know what she believed, what she was, who she was with her children. We don't know if she was this kind of saint, but we build as a nation, we build an image of people. So think about Churchill as well. Churchill got this great image of the one who actually stood against Hitler and made sure that we're still here today, and it was great. But at the same time, Churchill was a racist and didn't like Jews. So it's always, there's the image we build, the statues we erect, but there's also the reality. But it doesn't really matter, because at some point these people don't belong to themselves anymore, and they belong to a group. So, like De Gaulle in France, De Gaulle was the savior, but he actually tricked the Allies to make them believe that France was entirely behind them, when actually half of France and even more worked with the Nazis. So it's all about the reputation, the faith that we build around people. So Solomon has got this image of the archetypes of a king in the Bible. Even David. David is David, Melech Israel, etc. Even though he was, I don't think you can be in power and be pure of heaven. It says, power corrupts. I think it's a lesson really known. So, I came across this description of the Temple of Jerusalem. So, Let's read it together first, and then I will show you some reconstruction. So the building of the temple is described with lavish and intense detail in the Book of Kings. The narrative glorifies Solomon's international status and his power. And if you remember, I don't know if you read this text, but Solomon talked with King Hiram of Tyre, and he asked, for wood and for stones, etc. So that it was not something that he did on his own. He had all this network of allied kings that helped him to do that. Its building is a product of treaties between countries, and the huge numbers of workers and splendid materials involved are proudly itemized. Hiram, king of Tyre, agreed to provide cypress wood and cedar from Lebanon, as well as required expertise in stone cutting. It is something of a surprise to modern eyes of grandeur that, despite the number of workers, the building itself was not massive. The first temple was 60 cubits long, so 1 cubit is about half a meter. So it's 30 meters long, 19 inches, I don't know, I can't do inches, I'm sorry. 20 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. So it's 30 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 15 meters high, which is maybe the size of our synagogue, more or less. I mean, it's probably a bit wider, but it's not a big building. There was a 10 cubic deep vestibule or porch along the front, and a portico of side rooms along the other 3 sides. It will not be misleading to say that the temple was about 30 meters long. If you include the walls, porch, and porticos, the outside measurements of the whole structure were about 50 meters long and 25 meters wide, the size of an Olympic swimming pool. It's not huge, huh? The interior was paneled with cedar, and the entire building was overlaid with gold inside. So here we got, it couldn't be such a big building because we had to find all the roof mats. The vestibule, I'm going to show you now maybe. So if you want to read something about the Jerusalem temple, there's this book by Synagogue here, The Temple of Jerusalem, which is pretty good. So it's and it's very, very accessible. So let's go back to
Is the temple referred to in any of the other literatures, any other countries? I mean, contemporary. Does anyone talk about Solomon and his temple? Other from other literatures that may or may not still survive. Does anyone else ever talk about Solomon?
you mean literature of the time?
Yes, I mean, did anyone contemporary at that time write, not in this throne, nothing to do with Solomon,
Yeah.
write about the temple or Solomon?
Yes, Solomon definitely.
He's mentioned, is he?
Yeah, he
It's
was
a
mentioned.
Hittite text or something.
Yes, and in Egypt as well, the 10 Amarna tablets that they, which were kept, the archives of the pharaohs with all the international negotiations they had. So that it's documented outside the material. But I don't know about the temple. I know that there are very similar temples they found in the Middle East, in similar form, shapes, and construction. I don't know. I can't tell that.
I just wondered if it was mentioned that anyone else at the time wrote about it and whether that survived at all. Would you say it is mentioned in Egyptian?
Solomon is mentioned, definitely.
Yes.
Solomon, but the temple, I don't know.
No, but Solomon.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be in the old Christian literature?
So that's the second temple.
Ah, right, not the
Yes.
first.
So the second temple is mentioned outside Jewish scriptures, and Christian scriptures, and other places as well. But the first temple, I can't tell. I don't know that. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So let's go now. So that's basically the first temple. I don't know if you can see. Yes, so you've got here the structure of the temple. You've got the temple here, and it belonged to a complex with the temple, the palace of the king, the palace of the queen, and also the house, how does it call again? House of the Forest of Lebanon, yes, which was a kind of place where they would welcome foreign dignitaries. It's kind of the equivalent today in Buckingham that they've been there, but the place where you welcome dignitaries. But the temple is really in the back. I don't know if you look, the temple is really in the back of this whole complex. So that's the Temple Mount, and that, possibly how it will look like. So we've got the entrance, we've got the two columns, Yakin and Boaz, which you know about. And these two columns don't have any structural utility. It was more kind of like a bit, can you picture Egyptian temple? They have these big pillars, this big structure at the entrance, and that marks, the passage. So you go through between these columns and you enter the temple. It's probably that, that represents. And the different courts here. So I think we've got here the vestibules. The two columns, the vestibules, the holy and the holy of holies. And if you look at, you go up like this and up like this, and here was preserved or contained the Ark of Covenant with the tablets of the Law. So that's how this temple looked like. Very difficult to say because there's nothing that remained, nothing accessible we found about that. So the only reference we have about these temples are what we can find in the Bible. And also by comparing the biblical, so what archaeologists have done in the 19th century, they compare the biblical material with what's been found outside of Jerusalem and other places in the Middle East. And this type of temple was quite common in those days, especially in the north. Any questions so far? Okay, now let's have a look at the book of Leviticus, and because the book of Leviticus explains exactly how, I don't know if you can see, yes, how this temple was actually used. So the book of Leviticus is the one, that is a bit problematic when you want to do a nice Dvar Torah and explain something relevant for us Jews today, but basically the book of Leviticus was a kind of a handbook for the priest, what to do in the Temple of Jerusalem, and how we used the Temple of Jerusalem to pass from a state of purity or impurity a state of impurity to purity. It's a concept that is very, very complicated for us to understand because we don't talk about purity and impurity as they used to talk in those days. So basically what made you impure was touching a death, touching blood, sorry? So death, a dead person would make you impure. There are many passages in Torah that explain that, for example, you know that there is the possibility to mark Pesach a second time a month later. It's called Pesach Sheni. And the reason given in Torah is because a group of people stumble upon a dead body and they touch a dead body by mistake, and then they got impure and they couldn't offer the sacrifice of Pesach. So then they spoke to Moses, we spoke to God, we came back to Moses and they said, it's okay, they can do this in a month from now, because there was this pure impurity. There's also and then we go into gory details about bodily emissions, and I'm not going to go into that because it's quite, all the bodily emissions that you can touch. For example, if you have a semen discharge during the night, you're impure, etc. So there's a lot of cause, everything that has to do with life and death. So if you touch anything that makes you in contact with death, that makes you impure. So then you have to regain the state of purity, ritual. It's a ritual purity, it's not mental purity. Yeah? So therefore you've got some rituals to perform, like going into the waters. The mikveh, for example, was a way to retain a state of purity. What else? So anytime there is a sin, what we call a sin, a breaking of a covenant, you do something that is not right. We talk about this on Yom Kippur extensively, Al Shem, Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha, for the sin we have committed against you by doing this, lying, stealing, all these things. In the Temple of Jerusalem, you would have, sacrifices to offer. So you bring a sacrifice and it would be okay. So in the book of Leviticus, you also get some explanations about how priests are ordained, how priests are qualified here. For example, there are things that disqualify someone to be a priest. If you are disabled, you can't be a priest. There's the case of a priest with crushed testicles who cannot be a priest. So it's very graphic sometimes. And of course, in the middle, which is probably the most interesting part for us today, is what's called moral purity. So that's, the Leviticus 18 to 20, especially 19, which is really in the middle of the book of Leviticus, explains all the things we shall do as human beings towards other human beings. And I don't like this notion of purity and impurity. I think it's very dangerous. Purity has been used, by so many people to kill Jews, for example. The laws of Nuremberg in 1935 were called the protection of the purity of German blood. So it's a dangerous concept. And we want to purify a region by getting rid of people we consider impure. But it's a misinterpretation of the notion of purity in the Bible, because it's more a state of being far away from God or close to God. That's basically what purity says about. So if you look into the different...
The one you left out.
Yes.
It's only just recently been allowed. There's females to be prisoners.
Yes, so that's a very interesting point. Traditionally in Judaism, when a woman has a period, she is for two weeks impure, and she has to separate herself from her husband, and everything that she touches is impure.
So it was a common right around the world.
Yes, in Hinduism, they have us in Hinduism, if a woman has a period, she cannot go to, she cannot enter a temple, so there's this kind of, the way we understand it in Judaism, because it's a life that potentially could have come into fruition and never came, but therefore, but it's kind of a weird thing to do. And I never heard anyone in the Reformed Synagogue applying these laws of nidar, separation between men and women, because it's kind of it's weird. I understand the rationale behind it, but
in Orthodoxy, there's always a separation.
yes.
And they
Yeah.
haven't changed.
No, they haven't changed, yes. Women are upstairs, women can be... I don't know, there are some female rabbis in the Orthodox synagogues that started to ordain female rabbis.
Yeah, starting to infiltrate.
Infiltrate, yes, yeah.
Women go to the temple just as much as men. Once they went in, they were separated, were they, in the temple.
So,
In biblical times, if a husband and wife went to a temple together, did they sit together or were they
yes.
separated?
So that's an interesting point, because in Masada they found a synagogue, and there is no separation for women. So women and men would sit next to each other. It's only later, it's only a Middle-aged thing, and it's only under the influence of Islam that women were separated in the synagogue. But before that, there was no separation. In the Temple of Jerusalem, women were allowed only to a certain extent. And because in traditional Judaism, women are not fully They don't have the full rights as men do. But they were also excluded from getting closer to the center of the temple as well.
And in the original with masonry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Under the constitution, women can't be Freemasons. I mean, there are female orders that orders that reshape women, men and women together. Yes, of course. But it's kind of just but I understand the rationalization of that. I understand the reason people bring to explain why they separate sexes. But there's part of me who just don't get it. I just won't get it.
Only until recently, the women could fly out.
Yes.
It really is quite a modern trend.
Yes, it's very recent and it's not everywhere.
They can clean them. But
Clean kitchen.
Very recently, then we could fly there.
I mean, the fact that you couldn't have a female pilot.
I think at the end of the very end of the First World War.
Yes, because they
There
transported.
wasn't much enough flying before.
Yeah.
A short time.
The Boeing was flew across the sea.
Very short time.
But Joyce, remind me, you were one of the first women to enter Cambridge, I remember what you said.
Very not what?
One of the first women student in Cambridge.
No. My mother was a student at Cambridge.
Okay.
No. Women were admitted to Cambridge. They were admitted to Cambridge before the First World War.
Okay.
But they weren't allowed to take degrees until near the end, just before the Second World War. I mean, they had their degrees, but they weren't full members of the university until I think about 1937.
Wow. Okay.
But there were women from the end of the
Okay.
century before last.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this prejudice against women originate from the Bible. Right? So, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. I just wanted to give you an idea of the different types of sacrifices in the Old Testament. In Torah, so you've got, the burnt offering, the sin offering, so olah, chatat, the guilt, trespass offering, hasham, the peace offering, shlamim, and the meal offering, mincha. So, of course, if you're interested and if you want to learn everything about sacrifices in Torah, I'm very happy to send you this slide. But it's kind of it's interesting to understand why what they did in the Temple of Jerusalem. So some of these offerings were completely burned. Some of these offerings were and the blood was spread on the floor, of course, because you can't consume blood. And it can be cattle, or grains, or wine, or oil, pigeon, goats, incense, and depending. So it's a very clear system. So you can imagine. Let's imagine a moment, a day in the Temple of Jerusalem, because I think it's kind of interesting to think about that. So it starts with the trumpets, announcing the start of the day. And then the priests do the first daily offering in the morning. And then you have people coming to the temple with an offering for whatever reason. So it can be cattle, pigeon, wine, oil, flour, etc. Just because they did something wrong and they want to repair what they done. So the priest would welcome them, would offer the sacrifice, perform the ritual, and then people would leave the temple with a slate clean and starting from scratch again. Then you have the afternoon service and the evening service, again performed by the priest. So we have to imagine the Temple of Jerusalem is a very buzzing place, with many people coming all the time. with fire, incense burning, like a slaughterhouse, really, with lots of blood running all over the place. Must have been quite weird to see that. But a place where also people will bring their taxes, the half shekel for the temple. So it's also temples in antiquity were really the center of wealth. And the priests, the high priests, were very wealthy in those days.
Did the priest eat this meat?
Yes. So there was part of the sacrifices that were left for the priest, called tiruma, which is one type of offering.
Breast and right leg, it's given to the priest for his family.
Yes, sometimes, sometimes we even specified.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You can read that. And the breads and the offerings, would that be at festivals as well?
The breast and the right leg given to the priest and his family.
Yeah.
The rest eaten by the individual, his family, the poor, and the Levites.
Yeah, it's here, yes, yeah. The poor, the Levites, etc. Yeah, I mean, there was no waste. They didn't waste any food. It was given away to, and it was the way the priest would actually get. It was kind of a salaries priest, the priest's salary, sorry. So for them it was. So that the priests in the land of Israel were divided in 24 sections, and they would come to serve in the temple in appointed time. So it wasn't always the same. But in each village you had priests and Levites, and they would be called for a certain period of time to perform sacrifice and rituals in the Temple of Jerusalem. So the Levites were the ones who were, cleaning but also singing and doing all the worship. And the priests were the ones who would offer the sacrifice and make sure that the whole system.
So some of these festivals then, people from
Yes.
outside Jerusalem would bring,
Yes.
say, wheat and bark and the...
There were three pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shabbat, and Sukkot. All people would literally flock to the temple and bring the first fruit of their productions. Now, let's go a bit into the second temple. So, the second temple, which was built in the late 6th century. So here it's the Herod's temple because the second temple was built by, I don't know if you've heard his name, a guy called Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel came back from exile from Babylon with the children of Israel and was allowed to rebuild the temple, but we don't know how it looked like. What we know more is about the temple of Herod, because it was described extensively by Josephus, for example, and other Roman Jewish authors, Joseph and I don't remember the names of them. So it gives you here you've got an idea of the size of both temples. So the Temple of Solomon, pretty small, and the Temple of Herod is kind of very, very big building, probably very spectacular. And really marking it. So Herod was a very interesting character in the Bible. He's mentioned in the New Testament as the arch-villain. Herod was a Jewish king, an ally of the Romans. He had, so the rabbis didn't like him because apparently his lineage wasn't that kosher. So they didn't really like him. But he was a Jewish king, and he built a lot in Israel. And if you go to Israel today, Caesarea, for example, by the sea, was a city built by Herod. And he built another place which is well known as Masada as well. There's a palace that Herod built there. So he was a builder. He was a builder, very important builder. So he reigned at the time of Jesus. And we have, it's mentioned in the New Testament.
Who were the labourers building?
That's a good question. So they had skilled professionals, people they would hire to do the work, like some equivalent of architects and artisans, people would be able to do that. And the basic labor was done by poor people from the countryside and also by slaves. Antiquity worked on slavery very much. That was the main force in antiquity. They didn't have machines, they used slave labor.
So on the first slide, you had someone bringing timber from somewhere, wasn't it?
They've got a window.
Yes, remember the cedar was being provided by some, on the very first temple.
This slide? No.
No, sorry, the first, when they got the first temple, and you had the image of that one there.
Yeah.
Somewhere just after that, you mentioned the fact that wood was promised from somewhere.
Oh yes.
The cedar, so obviously, and the artisans also came.
Yes.
So I presume a similar thing would happen.
Absolutely, yes. So
As if you build a cathedral, the history of building a cathedral.
it wasn't local.
100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah,
They've got
absolutely.
villages and towns just how to build it.
Interesting, you've got the chamber of lepers.
Chamber of Lepers, yes. So when you read passages from the Mishnah, for example, it's not always clear which temple they describe.
Yeah.
It's most likely the second temple because they describe what they saw. So the early rabbis knew this temple before it was destroyed. So their understanding of the temple of Jerusalem was the second temple. And so you had the first temple and the second temple, and sometimes there's some confusion. But the structure is the same, so kind of a big slaughterhouse. Next slide.
There was a slaughterhouse on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a women's courtyard. Women were allowed here. And this is where actually all sacrifices took place. No, sorry, in front here, where the altar is. So it's a kind of do you remember this story of Jesus chasing the merchants out of the temple? Because the temple was kind of a very, very big
they had a one beyond the
business center.
where they sold the
So it's an area around the Herod's temple with a Solomon's porch. So it gives us a very good understanding of how it works. So we've got the Mount of Olives and the Solomon's porch. So you had people actually trading there.
They were Gentiles, wasn't it? That was the Gentile.
Yes, so they were around here. Absolutely.
Is the structure basically stone?
Yes.
Because otherwise there's been a very great fire hazard.
Yes, and yet it burned down. The Romans burned it down because inside the temple you had panels of wood, and so the inside was a panel of wood. So we don't really know how it happened. So there is reports of Roman soldiers, because Titus, the general who besieged Jerusalem, didn't want to destroy the temple. It wasn't his decision. And his general said, no, you have to destroy the temple because Jews will always come back if the temple is standing. And one of the soldiers threw, according to Josephus, one of the soldiers threw the torch inside the temple through a window, and all the wood and the cloths and the curtains started to burn down. And of course, when the stone is heated like this, it falls. So a bit of archaeology here. So that's the southern part of the Temple Mount. If you look here, it's this part, okay? And this part was excavated, what was it, I think in the 19th century, and they discovered the stairs that would allow people to enter the Temple Mount. Because the Shira Malot, the Hallel that will be cited for certain occasions. So Psalm 118, 119, 120, no, it's type 1:4. So these songs were sung by people, by pilgrims coming into the Temple of Jerusalem. So you have to picture them going up through these stairs into the Temple Mount and getting closer to the temple itself. And they discovered this, which are the stairs of the second temple. So it's one of the few archaeological remains that are left. So of course you've got the mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque now on the top of it, which much later. And you understand why they don't want people to mess around with archaeological survey, because it's an important site for Islam as well. Right? So it's very, very tense there.
Christians used to build churches on mosques, and then when things reversed, the mosques were then rebuilt on the churches. It's always been a pattern to dominate the previous religion.
Absolutely, like layers, serious layers. So when the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century, they built a church there. And in the 7th century, when Islam came and they occupied Israel, Palestine, whatever, they built this amazing mosque in the dome of the mosque of the rock. It's a very old building. It's amazing. It's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, it's beautiful. And of course, you know, the destruction of Jerusalem is a kind of a big trauma in Jewish history, depicted in many, many ways. So I found this painting by David Roberts, and that's the summer for you. This happened in summer, so on the 17th of Tammuz, which is in July, they breached the western walls here, and on the 9th of Av, they destroyed the temple here. It took them 3 weeks, you know, to go through the city of Jerusalem, from the walls of the city to the temple, in 3 weeks, with intense fights, etc. And then burn everything down because they were really upset, you know. And Jerusalem was burned down, people were killed, and Jews were exiled. They were not allowed to stay in Jerusalem anymore, so they were sent to the north, to Galilee, and to the coast. And of course, they came back later. But this is really the major catastrophe in Jewish history, until the next major catastrophe, which would be the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And now, of course, the Shoah in the 20th century, which is the other major catastrophe. Each time it was an occasion to rebound and to reinvent things and to revive Judaism. And each time they managed to, just amazing the resilience that Jews have shown throughout history. Because this could have been the end of it. Like many cities, many city-states in antiquity ended like this. In antiquity, you know, when the city was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, there was nothing left. And then you've got Talmudic stories about rabbis going to see the emperor. Vespasian was there at the time, and begging to allow them to leave Jerusalem with the sacred text and to go to the coast. And they built another, I don't know if it's historically accurate, but the Talmudic narrative about around these days are, you know, the Romans allowed a few of us to leave the city and to rebuild Jewish life outside Judah.
Regarding this story, are there any examples of religions that were totally extinct? They all equal.
Yeah, many. Mithra, for example. I don't know how you pronounce this in English. Mithras. Yes. Yeah.
Nobody worships Greek.
Yeah, there are many religions. So what makes a religion survive time? It's a very interesting question. Because I know a guy who's a pagan, and he's actually Jewish by birth, but he decided to be a pagan, which is what Judaism makes you do sometimes. So, and he goes to Stonehenge, the solstice, and yeah. So paganism, Druidism is coming back, yes.
The thing is, you don't need a building as long as you've got a Torah.
Yeah, and the people.
Yeah, you carry that with you.
Yes,
You
yes.
know, wherever you are, it could be just a small structure.
And that's
So-
probably the reason why Judaism
So-
survived, yes. You take Torah under your arm and then you go away, yes.
I had a client who was a very senior Druid.
Oh, yes.
He was an architect, absolutely nuts. But he was really very senior, very.
I found it fascinating. I mean, do you know Rabbi Judith Rosenberry? She's a liberal rabbi. I mean, she doesn't have a community now, but she teaches philosophy in Oxford University. Judith Rosenberry. So she was asked by a Jewish pagan group to come and teach her. And she said, I don't want to talk. Jewish pagans, wow.
Not possible.
I mean,
Composition.
but what makes a group actually, when you have this kind of mad creativity, then you can survive. Because everything is possible. That's what makes a group survive.
When you say pagan, what do you mean?
Oh, so I've asked my friend to explain a bit more. So it's the old gods of Scandinavia.
Of Scandinavia.
For, and yes, so they have an innate connection with nature, and yeah. There's also a Satanist church in America. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. We've got somewhere where the Druids can get married into an old Christian church in like a Kiev. And then use it as rituals, I suppose, and make it more true than that.
But there's also a spiritualist church, There's one in Surbiton, not far from here. Yeah. I find it interesting, yes.
My mother was a spiritualist.
So you go there and you can actually talk to dead people. Is it a spiritualist? Is it spiritism? Yes. Wow. Yeah.
When I saw a program on television about, there's a site, it's about, I think about 10 miles off the coast of Israel, where there's a thing that's the bottom of the sea, but of course with these new military ways you can see under the sea.
Oh, yes.
Americans have these extraordinary things that you can see miles down. There's a thing that's almost exactly like Stonehenge.
Oh.
Just about 15 miles off the coast of Israel. Completely buried until now they've excavated. Well, they've excavated. I mean, they've gone down and can't breathe out, obviously, because it's stuck there. But it's almost exactly like
That's
Stonehenge.
interesting.
And it's about, I've forgotten how many miles across the coast of Israel. It's very close.
It's people worshipping this.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously the land was receded.
Yes.
Except for the sun.
And that must be extremely young, because it's not mentioned anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the coastline today, if you get a map, it's only 10,000 years old. Yeah? And Britain was connected to a continent. I don't know if that was. Yes.
And Northern Ireland to Scotland.
No,
The
I
causeway
understand.
to the
Yes,
sea.
yeah.
The causeway of the line.
Yes, yeah.
And they reckon it's big.
Is it where Boris Johnson wanted to build a bridge?
A bridge? I want to
Go
go.
on. Go on to Trump.
But was okay, so I'm going to end this because there's also things to say about the fate of the temple after the temple. How the temple was described, for example, in the book of Ezekiel as the third temple coming down from heaven. So the temple has become very important in esoteric movements as the purest form of abode for God on the earth. And Ezekiel is actually describing the temple that will be rebuilt. The temple is also very important, for example, for the Templars, the Templars Knights, who disappeared, but also connected to it. So the temple has become this kind of ideal place of encounter between God and anyone. It's not a Jewish building anymore now. And of course in Freemasonry as well, the Temple of Jerusalem is very important because it's building the living Temple of Jerusalem, etc., etc. So there are many places where the temple has survived today.
The architects who built it.
Yes, yeah, probably. So I think we have a better understanding of the temple. And of course today we don't pray for the restoration of the Temple of Jerusalem anymore.
I know what else is in the nature, but the Mormon church, the
Oh, yes.
Mormon church actually have an altar and everything replicating
Yes.
for their priests, which you were only allowed in before they consecrated it.
Yes.
So you were allowed to remember taking my children.
There's also the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam that is supposed to be built on the model of the Temple of Jerusalem. So it's become this kind of, the purest form of, yes. So if you think about the word Yerushalayim in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, which is a dual form, it means two Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, like Yadayim, two hands, or Aglayim, two legs. So by two Jerusalem, there's Jerusalem Shelmala, Jerusalem from above, and Jerusalem Shelmata, Jerusalem from below. And according to the mystical tradition, at the end of the time, both Jerusalem will come together and it will be another world. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is it working? No? How do we stop it? No? Okay. Yes. Okay, I need to press yes. Where's yes?
We have to press again twice. Press again.
Ah. Thank you. Right.
Thank you. Very enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I didn't look at all that. Oh, Miriam. Salut Miriam. Hello Rebecca and Alex. Shannon and Deborah. Thank you for coming. Sorry, I didn't look at my phone before that, but thank you for coming back. Right. Okay. I think it's time for Kiddush now. Right? So let's go into energy.